Super excited tonight because we have our final program of this wonderful exhibition. And just so you all know, if you haven't had a chance to take a look, you can obviously do so tomorrow and Saturday, which are the last 2 days, 12 to 5. But I believe all of you got a chance to. So I'd like to introduce our panelists tonight, 2 of which are going to be joining us via Zoom. We have Daniela N, Molnar, who's an artist, poet, pigment worker. She's also a wilderness guide, an educator, and of course the curator of Geohaptics. We have also joining us from Atlanta, Jason Francisco, who works in the spaces between photography, writing, historical research, and poetics. His work is right upstairs on the desk. It's that beautiful, intimate book that you can take a look at, and I really recommend spending some time with it. We also have here Carol Padberg, who's an artist, writer, and an educator, who works with regenerative textiles, using ancestral spinning and weaving techniques, and also draws from and works with the Cuesta Superfund mine site. And Carol's work is this bay right here, as well as works upstairs in the back, like left corner. Joining us virtually on screen now, we have Heidi Gustafson joining us from Washington. Heidi is an incredible ochre specialist whose work upstairs was actually activated and utilized in a pigment workshop that she gave last Saturday. So I recommend taking a look in the catalog at what it looked like before and its state right now, which is essentially gone. But yeah, I'll let Heidi speak to that when we start the talk. Also joining us, who you can't see, but who will appear on screen when she speaks, is Sarah Gerats? Okay. Who is hailing in from Svalbard. So that is it's not the most northern
It's
point.
the farthest northern settlement in the world.
Okay.
Yes.
It's the farthest northern settlement in the world, in the Arctic. So obviously she could not join us in person. And she's joining us from the middle of the night, basically. So, yeah, so as you can see, her work is right here. Staged scenarios documented through photography and through video. All right, thank you.
Thank you, JC.
So thank you all for being here. Thanks for coming out. We also have a bunch of people joining us on the YouTube channel and on Zoom. So we have virtual company as well. So mostly I don't want to be talking tonight. I mostly want the artist to be talking, but I want to just give a very brief introduction to the show. Also, we're not using microphones because it makes working with Zoom easier, but if you can't hear us, please raise a hand or let us know that you can't hear us. So the title of this show is Geohaptics, Sensing Climate. And I recognize some of you have been here before, and some of you it might be your first time seeing the show. Geohaptics is a made-up word. It's a neologism, and it combines this prefix geo, meaning earth, and haptic, meaning touch. So you put these 2 words together, and in its simplest definition, it means earth touch. But it can be expanded outward from there to mean many different things. In the catalog, which I hope you'll pick up a copy if you don't have one before you go, they're on the front desk. This is a quote by the poet Erin Robinson. This is her definition of geohaptics. The extreme intimacy of ecological entanglement via the air, water, and matter we take in and continually re-become. So to me, that quote is a beautiful definition and a beautiful reminder that there really is no separation between ourselves, our living human bodies, and the living earth. And that really is the overarching theme of all of the work in this show. And the show is really an invitation to think about ecological entanglement and ecological crises from a vantage that isn't just driven by fear or driven by apathy or driven by anger. All of these are valid emotions, of course. But I think that getting stuck in those emotions can prevent us from really experiencing the earth as it is fully alive and shifting as we are shifting and becoming something new in every moment. I'm so happy that the show is extending into spring too, because we get this very visceral reminder of how alive the earth is. We see things come up, we see the leaves come out. So with that brief introduction to the show, I wanted to start a conversation with these 4 extraordinary artists with us tonight, thinking about the role of empathy. Because there's so much in this show that has to do with just getting close to whatever it is that you're working with. Every artist in the show has a sustained practice of working with the earth, like decades of practice of working with the earth. And that, I think, necessitates a deep empathetic relationship. I want to read a brief quote by the neuroscientist Clayton Aldern. He's talking about mirror neurons here, which is a way that our brains work in which we're actually mirroring the world, and we do this from the day we're born. He says, "You are a mirror. You are 1,000 mirrors, each one flitting to and fro to capture the scattered light of the world and focus it to a point." So I think of each of the artists in this show as a mirror. And I don't know, Carol, if you maybe want to start just by thinking about upon what do you focus your gaze? And like, who are you mirroring? Who is mirroring you? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. First, thank you for coming out. It's such a pleasure to have this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to thinking aloud and learning together with everyone here. You know, I was recently pondering how so much of the world we live in is actually open space. And you can think of that in terms of the planet and this atmosphere. But you can also think about that in terms of the solar system and all the space between the planets, or at the atomic level, how much antimatter or dark matter there is and how little actual physical stuff there is. And so when I think about that question of mirroring, I'm struck by how it is through, for me, being still and pausing and tuning in to whether it's indigo or sheep or dog mane or clay. It's through that pausing and kind of taking in what is there in a very porous way that I mirror and make. So I find that question to be really provocative in terms of ways to be reminded of the big picture as well as the most tiny scale of the picture too.
Yeah, thank you. Jason, does that bring anything to mind for you, or how would you respond?
I think I have a lot of ways into that question. This is a very deep question you're asking.
It is.
And I guess for me, maybe one of the points of departure has to do with, in terms of art making, has to do with what I would call iconoclasm, or the breaking of given forms or given names and forms to receive that which is in some other configuration or some better, deeper configuration. I think a lot of the force of alienation and deadenness or numbness comes from familiarity with pre-given arrangements or what you call knowledge, or what you think of as knowledge in some fixed sense, which is knowledge of yourself or knowledge of what you apprehend. And for me, the mirroring task has to do with understanding what else there is, you might call it emptiness, that exists as the site of perception or apprehension, and what emptiness exists to be apprehended, and finding a kind of reciprocity or touch, if you want, between those two things. That's, for me, I guess, how I would begin answering that question.
It's interesting you both touched on like forms of emptiness and what you're seeking to mirror, who you're mirroring. Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I think living here, I've been living here for 12 years now in the Northern Post place. And the changes here, they are so fast. They are, in general, like 6 times faster than anywhere else on Earth. And I think there's no way of not sensing that. If you are here, you feel it all the time. You feel the heat, you feel the rain, you feel the unpredictability and the mudslides, the avalanches, the ice disappearing. So if you live here and if you are here, there is no way of not sensing it. And many people, there's very few people that live here for a long time. Many people come and they come for a short time. But I think the importance for me is to try to relate about that being here all the time, and the things you don't see when you just come for a short time, the changes that go over the years, the constant changes that are here in that sense. So trying to mirror that change which is here, which you only can see when you really live in the far, far north for an extended time instead of a shorter visit.
So a type of mirroring of time and how it's changing place for you.
Definitely, the time is a very important thing, which then in my work often becomes visible through repetition, doing something over and over and over again, and repeating and going back to places and being here. The time and the changes that are so fast through the years, or through the year, from month to month or week to week, but also from year to year, where the landscape is changing very fast.
Yeah. Thank you. Heidi, how about you? What are you thinking in response to this idea of empathy and mirroring?
Well, I feel like I'm actually feeling a lot more in not the emptiness and not the time, but the matter of the mirror, because of the materials that I work with that are upstairs. But in the red ochre world, you know, a lot of people imagine that the ochres, these minerals, make the color red. But if certain ones of them, if you polish them, they become mirrors, and they're one of our earliest mirrors that we have as a species. And also, if you interact with these red ochres by heating them with fire, of course, they melt into pure iron, which becomes another kind of, I would say, a colonial mirror in a way. So it's really, to me, I'm thinking a lot more about how our participation with the materials that we choose with as artists give us different kinds of mirrors. And sometimes those mirrors can look like an actual mirror physically and reflect, and other times they can be metaphorical mirrors and this whole other range, that's what's been striking me about this so far.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So the four of you have touched on like everything from mirroring emptiness to mirroring an actual mirror made of polished ochre, and kind of everything in between, mirroring time, which is a form of, you know, it's not material. But there's also, I think each of you touched on materiality in some way, and like be it like the dog bane and the, you know, the sheep and the ochres and the glaciers. And, you know, for you, your work upstairs has, to my eyes, a ton to do with mirroring weather and the ocean and these things that are present. And one of the themes that definitely runs through every artist work in this show and through the work of the four of you has to do with materiality, and the body, and like the poetics of materials. Like, what does it, I think every artist in this show is in communication with materials in a way that goes beyond like, I'm gonna make a painting and I'm gonna use paint to make the painting. It's like the material itself becomes a collaborator. Heidi, I think maybe you could start us off with this one, because I know it's such a rich seam in your work.
Yeah, I guess I'm also just immediately thinking of the etymology of matter, right? Matter as matter, which is the word for mother, matter as materiality, and matter as in how does it matter, the meaning of it. And so I love that everyone in the show is sort of, if not relating to the mother part of the word, at least really holding all of those aspects together, which I feel like in my work, there's this strong need almost for that, all those terms to collapse, so that when we are in relationship with matter, it's suddenly the borders dissolve between my body is earth, and the earth as mother, and myself as a mother, and myself as a kind of material, and it becomes this really fascinating, chaotic combination. So that once you're then in the actually carrying and working with, say, a piece of mineral matter, a mineral, it's exploding in front of your eyes into all these different ways that you can then connect to the earth's own chaotic presence, I think. And I can go more into that, but I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you. When you were talking about exploding, I thought about your workshop last weekend where we actually exploded your mountain with like, like broke it apart, a literal explosion. But
yeah.
Sarah, I know the matter you're working with is both photographic matter and also the glaciers and the landscape. I don't know if you want to talk about and the body and materiality. I mean, there's so much in your work as well. I don't know if you want to jump in and tell us a little bit about that in your own work.
Yeah, I think in a way there is no material at all. Like there's nothing else that is brought in or that is used to create something. But at the same time, there's a lot of material, which is the landscape and my body. And well, the landscape, it takes a lot of time of being in the landscape, a lot of time of not making photographs, a lot of time of moving through, getting to know, waiting for a moment that I can. And the body, yes, becomes very much material, especially here. As in many of the photos, you can see what the landscape writes onto my body. It's always very cold, and especially in winter, you will very quickly, I will see the marks of the ice and of the snow and of the cold on the body. So even more than in my earlier practice, I've always worked with the body, but even more than earlier, I see it as, and I feel it as a material, which then relates to the landscape. Which of course is always there, and nothing is changed or nothing is created in that way. There's only something created in a moment between me and the landscape. So I think, yeah, at the same time, no material at all and a lot.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Thank you.
Either of you two, thoughts?
Yeah, sometimes you're so in the middle of a thing that it's hard to articulate thoughts about it. I feel like my work is so much about the materiality and matter, and also so much about care and relationship and kinship with that matter that matters. I don't know where to start. I think that maybe the one strand I would pull out is For me, it is the temporal relationship of cultivating the seed that makes the plant, that grows the indigo, or raising the sheep and seeing them through their lifetime, and then working with the wool, perhaps receiving the blessing of that meat through eating it. All of that time is one expression of matter that brings me into my own physicality and the cycles of life and death, which is what life is, a cycle of life and death. And so I guess I can't really imagine matter without time. And that is very different than how I was raised to think about matter. Because I think growing up in a pretty typical American context, matter was a physical thing. Time was different, and relationship was perhaps something else again. And so for me, this exploration of matter has been a great unlearning.
And you talk about your materials as kin, and your I don't know if you want to talk about that word a bit, and why that word, and
Yeah. Speaking of unlearning, I think we're in a time where we're seeing the effects of hyper-individualism and colonialism and extraction. It's so obvious, it feels like, you know, almost dumb to say because it's so prevalent everywhere we look. And yet, I do believe that's the work of the moment. And so, for me to recognize the kin relationships, whether it is most generally between humans and the planet, or people and each other, or what we ingest and what we fertilize the earth with, all of that is so fascinating to me. I can't imagine a subject that could cut to the core of what it is to be a human right now, and the implications of thinking about kin rather than consumption. To me, that also is a really deep territory that it feels like a privilege to explore.
thank you. Any thoughts, Jason?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this. If photography, in a way, seems to me like it operates under a certain illusion of being immaterial, because it's a medium that, in a way, has no faith to its origin, to its origins. You know, if I make a photograph and I show it to you on a computer screen, and then I show it to you in a print or in a different print, you distinguish them, but you don't necessarily organize them hierarchically in terms of what's first and what's second. And I think this is something that photographers sort of suffer with, is the sort of tension between, you could call it the image and the object in the photograph. In my case, I think that's not really the site of my problem with when it comes to matter. It has more to do with the way that photography allows the world to have a claim on a picture or on an image, in ways that complicate whatever the artist's claim is, or whatever other claims could be made, like maybe it's the discourse around the art that makes its own claim, or the technology, in the case of photography, maybe makes a claim. But the world is always making a claim on a photograph, and to me that's a very exciting possibility, because it suggests that the world is intrinsically, in this medium, a kind of partner, that there's an inbuilt relationality that the photographer deals with, that's, to my way of thinking, is very different than what other kinds of mark makers are starting from.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
I don't know what you mean by the world making a claim on a photograph.
Oh, well, like if I'll show you what I mean.
Okay.
I'm pulling out my wallet, and this is my driver's license, and that's a picture that's me. Well, it's not, I'm not that flat, they're small.
You're not.
But it doesn't really, its status as a representation doesn't really depend on what the photographer did. It's that it supposedly shares some identity with its referent, me, that signifies. Or actually, there's an even better example of this. My teacher used to give this example that this is like a thought experiment. Like let's suppose that you see two identical images, whatever that means to you, and you're told an extra piece of information that one of them is a photograph and one of them is a painting. You can't distinguish them visually, but you're told that they're different. How do you see the one that you're told is the photograph as against the one that you're told is a painting? And with the implication being that the one that you're told is a photograph is a picture of that, whatever that thing is, and the one that is a painting is somehow a product of an interpretation, an artist's interpretation. So that's what I
Okay.
But anyway, in the case of the photographs that I made upstairs, I was living by the ocean, by the Mediterranean, and I realized that this ocean was very, just very germinating. It was really very activating in making as a partner, and that was that's the simple answer. But I have one more point that I want to put on the table. Can I?
Sure.
Okay, which goes back to the empathy question.
Yeah. They're very related, these
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, because when I think about empathy, it's the first thing that I think about is not the mirror exactly. It's something that comes from Edith Stein, who's this phenomenologist, early 20th century phenomenologist who writes beautifully about empathy. She's, I think, one of the most important thinkers about empathy, and she thinks that there's always a separation necessary, a differentiation between the self and the other for empathy to occur, which is not exactly a mirroring relationship. It's I think for her it's more mysterious than that. It's like a kind of immediate perception. It's got the status of immediate perception, but it's not oneness with.
Yeah.
It's something else. It's some encounter
Yeah.
that preserves the difference between. There's at one point I remember she writes that empathy is. She has this funny formulation: being at the foreign eye, capital I. Being at the foreign eye.
Yeah, so there's a distinction between the self and the other,
Right.
and that in order to bridge that distinction, empathy comes in.
Empathy is that transfer space.
And that's a very similar thing between an artist and her materials, in that, I know that I am not the sheep, or I am not the glacier, or I am not the ochre, or I'm not the ocean, but like that there's a relationship that's established there, which is empathetic and material and emotional. I think empathy, embedded in that word, is this idea of feeling. And that's another big theme in this show that I'd like to hear from you all on, because as I started out talking about the exhibit, I was talking about, the kind of dominant emotions that we're, I think, very much taught to feel in response to climate change or other ecological crises are apathy, fear, grief, and numbness. Those are like the things we're sort of taught to feel. And I think, I won't get on my soapbox, but I think there's reasons we're taught to feel those. And they're valid, and then there's also a tremendous amount of joy and wonder and love. And I think every artist in this show, in order to make the work you're making, there needs to be something that brings you, that sustains you, that makes you laugh. And that's another thing we don't talk about almost ever with environmental issues is humor. I want to start with you, Sarah, because something that I experienced, Sarah was my guide on a sailboat in the Arctic last fall. And something that I experienced which shocked me was that a bunch of Like, we couldn't stop laughing. And it's not that we weren't feeling sad. There's tremendous loss that you're witnessing on like an hourly, daily basis. And it was really affecting and really incredibly hard in so many ways. But we were also really like little kids. And there was a lot of humor and a lot of playfulness. So Sarah, I'm curious if you want to talk about that, because I imagine you've seen that many times, but also just about what sustains you, because you are really at the front lines in where you live and in the work you do, and like how you continue to do this work.
Yeah, it's true. There is often a lot of laughter and silliness, and I think that's absolutely needed as well. Because it is both. It is this really strong landscape. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's very painful to see those changes. So always in meeting these places, it's like a deep love where you know how beautiful it is, and you know how much you, well, for me then, how much I love it, but also it's so clear that it's disappearing or changing at least. But it's the same as with love. You cannot be completely open and completely embrace something while thinking all the time of that it will one day disappear. So you need this lightness, and you need to. There's no other way to deal with it every day, constantly. You cannot just sit down and breathe constantly. So I think it's a reaction to that intense feeling of the landscape, which up here is just always very intense with the changes. It's never the same from day to day. It's not the same from year to year. So it's a reaction I see a lot, and which I also use myself in the photos and in the videos. Some are serious, some are painful, some are relating to art history or to paintings, to thoughts about, well, and then there's the silly ones that are needed in this landscape. So I think it's just a way of dealing with it. And then of course it doesn't happen to everyone at the same time. So when I'm working there, I work usually with about 30 artists at the same time in this landscape over a long period of time. And some need this more than others. So also kind of trying to regulate that, or trying to make space for both the silence and the laughter, I think is a very important part in being here and in work, to give space to both of that, to be able to stay open and to take it in instead of having to shut off. So I think it's not such a strange reaction.
Yeah, you've been making these daily photographs of yourself in the self-portraits of yourself in the landscape for so long. And, you know, when we were deciding what work to put in this exhibition, you shared a bunch with me, and some of them were like laugh out loud funny, like some of them were very silly. And I'm curious, like, does that happen in the landscape, or is it something you plan? Like, is that premeditated, or is it like you get somewhere and you start to feel playful?
No, it's absolutely not. None of the photos are decided on forehand. And that's a freedom I found when I shifted from analog to digital photography, where I realized that I could leave the camera alone. So I'm always alone, and that's why I can be a silly, no one is looking, and I need that. Even an eye behind the camera wouldn't make the same work. So I use a tripod, I put the camera, and then I use interval shooting. So the camera will take a photo every other second. And then I go in. I leave the camera behind. I don't know when the photos are taken. I don't know what will happen. But I move in the landscape, and I'm there. And what exactly will happen, I don't know. And it can be that sometimes there is a more serious part followed by a funny or a light part. And usually, if you would be able to see, I usually take around 80 photos in a row. And if you would be able to see like the whole line of photos from which I then choose, you would see both the silliness and the seriousness, and the cold and the joy and the running and the sitting at the same time. But as you see one of the photos, it seems that some are more light and some are more serious. But usually in the series, there will be both of it present.
That's so interesting. So it's like an ongoing collaboration with the place, and a range of emotions and moods come up in that time, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's never anything that I decide. It's also not really that I have a place in mind. It's more depending on where I am and very much how the day is and how the light is, because they're never the same. So I'm always surprised by. I'm always waiting until such a moment arrives, and then I can make a photo. But it's not that I know on forehand, and I make many bad ones. There's many series that are not good at all, but I know that that is necessary. Maybe that's as necessary as the laughter and the lightness. It's necessary to not make a photo that I want to show, and to just keep doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to jump in.
This with you, Sarah, because I think that there is a really gorgeous, somewhat aching absurdity type of laughter in your work. And what I mean by that is it's so improbable to have these nudes in the Arctic and to celebrate the human form in such a vast landscape that has its own body. And I really enjoy how poignant and beautifully absurd it is. And I was wondering if that resonates with you at all.
I think when you use the word celebration, that's very, I never told before, but that's very to the point. Because when I started the series, which was in the summer of 2020, there was very many things were unclear, but one thing was very clear, and that was that I didn't want to, so I don't see them as self-portraits really, but of course it's my body, but it was very clear to me that I did not want the body to be passive or hanging or just standing. I was very clear that it would be experiencing and strong and celebrating in that sense. I think in the presence of being there. So I think that's a very good word for it.
An absurd celebration.
Yeah.
In the midst of dying glaciers. Yeah. Which might sound profane, but I understand it.
I don't know if you have thoughts, since we're looking at a screen, if you want to jump in, thinking about the range of emotions that come up in your work, including humor, but everything else, and what sustains you in the work that you do.
Well, I'm enjoying this thread that everyone's opening up, because I think what I'm hearing is sort of what occurs on the front line of embodied relationship to Earth, and I find this in my practice too, is that celebrating includes a huge range of emotions. And think about a normal celebration. You always have somebody who's a little pissed, someone who's a little frustrated, somebody who's super happy, somebody who's crying, and you're like, that is what celebration is that it can be a full expression of the range that we're capable of relating to someplace, someone, the Earth itself. And for me, what I've noticed is it's actually my immersion, and maybe Sarah relates to this. It's my immersion with the ochres that is my way into feeling what Earth is communicating at this point. And it's not that separation with the ochre in front of me. It's really that process of crushing it and then experiencing my body becoming that ochre that is also breaking me down. Once, say I'm making a pigment, and it's revealing like this image or this feeling of what the Earth is expressing to me through this microcosm experience. And so there's this, I don't know, there's like this way where we're all kind of on the front lines of the way how we're participating with what the Earth is going through as a whole, but also where it's showing up in our particular places, even if it's just the seed of a rock. Capturing that from, yeah.
So like the range of emotions comes up just in your interaction with the ochres. It's not like you're going into it wanting to experience something or seeking a particular experience, but that's what you're receiving, and that's the mirror that you're receiving.
Yeah, and also in my case, I'm receiving a lot of ochres from all over the planet, from people all over the planet who have sent them to me to work with and relate to. And so each of these ochres is also carrying its own particularity, its own personality, that's conveying oftentimes this a kind of single part of the spectrum of emotions. Like I might experience one rock as being particularly heavy, and maybe that rock is carrying the bodies of a mass death experience from 1 million years ago in deep time. Or I'm carrying a rock that a friend sent where their family is from, and that has a different kind of expression, or it had a river flowing over it, so it will feel a different way. And those are all ways in and out. Yeah, and moving through those. It really is also the like in that kinship way, I'm sort of witnessing and participating in the kinship of parts of the planet, just like my finger talks to my toes, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thoughts? People in the room? Artists in the room? Jason, you want to start?
Wait, where are we now?
We're thinking about emotions in your work, and how you, in making work that's in collaboration with the earth, what you receive and what sustains you in that practice at this moment in time, which is a difficult, prolonged moment in which to be making work in collaboration with the earth, about the earth.
It seems like there are two stages of it to me. One is the act of doing it, the act of being in the midst of doing it, and then there's its aftermath, which is the work itself. That I guess for me, I think of as more of a byproduct than a product. And what's really the most important part is doing it. It's really being there and doing it, and the sense of absorption. I think that Heidi used the word immersion, and that's exactly it. It's a kind of attention that feels self-losing or self-escaping, self-transporting, and that's that. I don't know what word to assign that feeling. It's not. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't correspond to words like celebration or, I don't know. It's a positive feeling, but it's so, it's loosened from other experiences in such a way that I don't know what word to call it.
I know what you're talking about, though. Like sometimes I'll write a poem that is absolutely devastating, but the act of writing it is not devastating. Like the losing oneself in language or losing oneself in any material is an act of relation that's good.
Yeah, and I would add that, we're in a mental health crisis amongst young people in particular. It's really understandable. But I was really happy that you came up with this idea for a show, which is about doing and experiencing and having that link to the world through embodied action and embodied perception. Could perception ever not be embodied? Because I think there's something about this that has to do with a path forward that can help us handle and navigate the pain that we feel. I don't want to speak for anyone other than myself, but there's a lot of pain that I feel, and making really helps ground me and help me feel connected and helps my mental health.
Yeah, thank you. I want to move on to Q&A soon, but before, and give you all a chance to ask questions, and maybe we'll do people online too. Before we do that, I'm hoping that the four of you could just, there's a lot of text that's a part of this show. There's a really intentionally deep relationship between verbal language and visual language in this show. And we had 2 poets read, who I consider to be artists in this show. There's a lot of wall text, there's a lot of poetry embedded in the wall text. So I asked each of you to think about, I included at least 3, sometimes more quotes with everyone's work. And I asked you to think about what quote stood out to you and why. I don't know if you want to start us off, Carol. It looks like you have an idea.
Donna Haraway is a writer that a lot of people struggle with because she will use language in a kind of ornate way that unravels the words or highlights a twist of a phrase in a way that can feel a little like Gertrude Stein, you know, repetitions, and yet I loved it when you chose that because she has been an inspiration for me in terms of an early time where I was both giving myself permission to relate to other species in a way that felt true, because I had been so raised to think that maybe I was imagining that and it was just anthropomorphizing. But her writing provided me an open doorway to interspecies communications. And then later on, when I started writing myself, it was liberating to see how she was playing with language and how, you know, you can create a space of possibility and creativity by giving yourself total freedom with words. And so I was glad that you chose her in that group here.
I want to, because it's such a fun quote. Where are you? Here somewhere. I know your work's in this book. So I'm going to read it just because it's fun to read and it's fun to hear. And you'll hear the kind of playfulness and the difficulty that Carol was just talking about. So Donna Haraway writes, "It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots knot knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories." So thanks, Donna Haraway. Heidi, how about you? Is there a quote that stood out to you that you want to talk about a bit?
Yeah, and also a little bit about language. You were bringing that one in too.
Yeah.
Well, I think the quote that I love and you highlighted was the one by James Elkins that says, "Paint is water and stone, and it is also liquid thought."
Yeah.
But I also think about it as liquid place or activated soil. So water and stone is paint, but it's also soil and it's a place. And this is a really, and liquid thought, and it's also connected to language because so much in my practice, so much that I'm exploring and that I've learned from especially my Indigenous friends, my friends who run this Earth Pigment Collective, Kawairaro, that are Maori, is how interconnected language and ochres are, and the erasure of language and erasing where our materials are from. So I'm not being exactly clear, but in the ochre traditions, there's so many names for each of these materials that are not ochre. And there's so many ways of naming that place as a kind of liquid thought that's specific to the place where these ochres are from in the Indigenous native language that those ochres have been called for time immemorial. And so for me, a lot of this has been really, again, like Carol was pointing out, unlearning the language of the simplification of the names of our materials: plant, dandelion, ochre, because ochre, even in the arts, like we only think of it as yellow ochre or burnt sienna, but it has all of these other tones and all of these other connections that tell you something about where it's from, or used to tell you something. So a lot of my work, or what I'm interested in, is this, like, how does our connection to language actually erase our connection to material?
Yeah, I love that. It can strengthen or erase it. And by interacting with the indigenous languages in particular, that and the communities that teach you those languages, you're given a whole world of insight into what that ochre means in relationship to the people and the place, which are very enmeshed. Yeah.
Yeah, and in a way, hearing the word of an ochre is a sacred act, just as much as touching a place and then leaving it behind, right? So there's also this level of the being silent in the face of something, where the magic or the divine or the sacred comes through.
Yeah, thank you. Jason, I know you think a lot about language. What's your response to this?
I think in this conversation, I'm on the opposite side of the spectrum, meaning that I'm not a nominalist in this case. In other words, I want to extract myself from the urge to name and the clutch of names and the obligations that names impose, or the barrier that names sometimes form. And what I'm interested in those photographs upstairs has a lot to do with what I cannot recognize, what doesn't have a word that corresponds with it, or a state of apprehension or encounter which is like liberated in a sense from the act of naming or claiming through name. And so there's a non-verbal aspect of it which I think is very important in this case. This is not always true for me, not at all, but in this case I think I really feel that way. And apropos your quotations, it was the Rimbaud quotation, which I think really touched me most because they're all great, but the quotation from Rimbaud seems especially fitting because, oh, do you want to read it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that we all know what we're talking about. So it's a few lines from a poem, and he writes, "I have recovered it. What? Eternity. It is the sea matched with the sun."
Right, so the language is very, very non-descriptively simple in a sense. And when I think about Rimbaud, one of the things I love about his work is his relationship to the unknown. And that this in a way is what he wants out of poetics. He wants to touch the unknown and not convert it into the known. He wants to leave it unknown and have that experience be true to itself. And so in this connection, the act of naming is an act from the side of knowing. And the act of not naming seems to me like a certain gesture on the side of the unknown or the not knowing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Sarah, any thoughts on this?
Language
Not
quotation?
much, no. It's while I'm listening, I'm thinking, because I haven't seen the exhibition and I haven't seen the catalog, which makes a lot of sense, I think, being here at the end of the world. Also during this conversation, I realized that it is since I moved up here that I haven't been making anything material other than photos in that sense. So everything is very, I have to imagine a lot to imagine the exhibition, to imagine the catalog. And that is, I think, thinking of language. I am mostly, no, I cannot speak so much about it. I live in a language which is not my own. I work in another language which is not my own. So I'm always a little bit at loss for that. Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I think it's a particularly interesting question for you, and you will get a catalog eventually. It's probably taking its sweet time to make its way to you, but because you, like many Europeans, you think and speak in multiple languages and understand the fluidity of language and the ways that one language can say a thing that another language absolutely can't. But I respect that there's, it's hard to talk about that. But the photographs are their own language as well. Your work is, everyone's work in this show is its own language. I want to point out one thing before we open it up to Q&A, which for those of you who are in the space can see that photograph there, which is next to Bailey Liu's cyanotypes, is a collaboration between Bailey and Sarah, in which it just sort of was an impromptu moment. You can read about it in the wall text if you want to learn more about what exactly happened there. But to me, that is also like a form of language. It's like two people who think, obviously use words to communicate, but think in terms of image, think in terms of place, think in terms of collaboration with place more than with each other. This wasn't a planned thing. So that to me is also like, that feels to me like a poem or like a quotation, that moment that exists in that piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know the piece I'm talking about. You can picture it. Yeah.
I think on that moment something came together.
Uh-huh.
Because I don't see it as much as a collaboration as that I was just helping her, because at that point I was in my role of expedition leader or like working on the ship, but it was very much a moment where I recognized something that she wanted to make, for which she needed someone who could that language in that way in what she wanted to make, and then it came together. In that very moment, without much discussion.
Your body could be that language in that moment. Yeah, I like that way of putting it.
Thank you all. I'd love to, I don't know if anyone in the room has, yeah, Erin, please. You're ready.
I love this conversation and how it's focused around materials and empathy and emotion and what keeps an artist going and kind of the private behind the scenes parts of practice, and that each of you seem to have such a durational commitment to your work and to the places where your work happens, to Earth. And I guess I wonder, like, what is the public aspect of art making do for each of you? Because I can imagine how it might be sort of an annoyance to try to show up in an exhibition or a panel discussion and put into words these things that are so durational and deep. But maybe it also creates some kind of container or a way of communicating, or I guess I'm just curious, like, how do you think of the public in work that's so intimate?
Yeah,
almost exists without the public.
Yeah. Anyone feel like jumping in?
I can address
I couldn't hear the question. Sorry,
Right.
I can only hear.
Thank you for reminding us.
Thank you. I will try to paraphrase what was a rich question, but it's about the role of the public, like showing your work to the public or participating in a public conversation like this. And because so much of your work you make it alone, and that's an important aspect of the work. So much of the work is about communication with the more than human world. So what does it mean? How does it factor into your practice to communicate with other humans about your work? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Audience might be.
Audience. Yes. Go for it.
Well, to me, there's a story from the poet Ossip Mandelstam that I think about with regard to audience. He described a poem as a kind of a miracle, a certain kind of miracle in which a poet writes something, puts it in a bottle, throws it into the ocean, and the ocean takes that bottle and puts it down on a beach somewhere, and someone walks along and sees the bottle and pulls out the piece of paper in it and finds out that it was written exactly to her. And that strangeness, the strangeness of that, is the only way I can really make sense of audience from inside the act of doing it. Like there's a strange promise that some person, somewhere, completely unknown, will receive something, really receive it. And it's an abstraction that's kind of narrativized in a way that's intimate, but I don't know how else to think about it.
I don't take audience for granted, because part of what I had to do to grow as an artist in the last 10 years was to give up the idea that what I would do would be of interest in a white cube. And I don't think I could have made set the premises that I set if I were designing it for an audience in a gallery or museum context, which is weird because I'm a devoted art educator. I love seeing art and participating in that conversation, and yet there was something I needed to do about, I just need to do this and let the cards land where they land. And so it's really been a gift, and I have to thank you so deeply to see the work communicate in this type of space. And it's had me thinking a lot about what that is and why it's still important. And I've been thinking about how in a world that seems to be wringing nuance out like you wring out a sponge, and going for bold dichotomies and difficult to bridge, points of view. I think art is, and this is not an original thought, but as many have said before me, art is one of the spaces that does subtlety the best. And that's a responsibility for those of us who have that interest. It's a responsibility to audiences, it's a responsibility to artists, and it feels really humbling to be part of that whole conversation, because I think that's expressing something about humanity that is really important.
Thank you, I love that. Heidi, I don't know if you have thoughts on this. You do a lot of public work, actually.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, complicated question, and I feel like, to be really honest, what's coming to my mind about it is just how much I have a really deep spiritual practice where I connect to ochre as a kind of inner guide, and so I have these kind of secret or inner ways of relating to the ochre, and then I feel like everything else in my life, my home, anything I make, anything I participate in, all the people I talk to, that's all for the audience. That's all public. And so, and it's all offering, really. And I really listen to what I consider the voice of ochre, the voice of stones, as my guiding principle of what to talk about with people, what to share in different degrees of public information or outer world information, and then what to also bring back to the ochres and say, you want some more hands on you, like I'm going to bring all these people to you, and we're going to touch you, and we're going to hold you together, and we're going to do things together. And then other times, so this is this big interesting range where I think that there are always, just like the deep time sediment layer, there's a degree where it's almost always still part of the public world to me. And I feel like it's an evolutionary privilege to even imagine having a private aspect to any practice on earth.
Sarah, anything you want to add about your work, public and private?
Yeah,
Audience?
I think my work is very, very private, in fact. I have a small circle around me who sees everything. But apart from that, it needs someone to see me, to see my work like you did. for it to be more public, for it to reach an audience. I think it has to do also with living so far away. Show galleries, exhibitions, the art world, it becomes something else here. It is not a center of my life. So for me, on my own, I don't find that, or I work with the landscape, with the nature. I'm here, and I love the making itself. I put all my time in that. So for me, it needs someone to see and to put language on it, to communicate it, to bring it to an audience, which I'm very thankful for that happens sometimes.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions that anyone? I saw your hand first, and then we'll move to you. Yeah.
So this has been something that I've been thinking about lately as my friend and I sort of embarked on an art collective. But what is art's place, do you all think, in dreaming into the future where I assume we all hope to bring in, where humans are living in greater reciprocity with our more than human kin?
Yeah, what a great question. I'm going to repeat it, or try to repeat it for the people virtually joining us. What is art's place in helping realize a future in which humans are more in a sustainable relationship with our more than human kin? How can art contribute to that? Did I do an okay job?
Sure.
Okay.
I would maybe use reciprocity instead of sustainability.
Thank you. That's a better word.
Yeah.
So establishing more reciprocity. Sustainability is a little word in this country, at least. So how can art help establish more reciprocity between humans and the rest of the living world? Thank you. Big question. Important question. Yeah. Anyone jump in? Who has the answer?
And it's for you personally.
Yeah, I'm happy to try.
Thanks, Heidi.
I just, in a really simple way, I think I've been curious about the role of understanding our deep ancestral connection to the biomineral coevolution of our bodies and our beings, and these kind of origin stories of the way we've grown our mineral skeletons, the way we've come out of the scum of the deep ocean. And I feel like that's one of the ways I've found that can most immediately and deeply connect me to the role of reciprocity when I am in a lineage of Earth's experimentation and Earth's own creative life force. And I'm like I'm just this, slimy little thing for a moment moving around trying, but as an artist, I feel really privileged that we get to name that, explore that, talk to the rocks about talk to them like family, and to try to convey that with each other, with you. And I think that's part of the great gift that does help realize alternative futures and futures that are not dominated by our current dominant culture.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's just a first.
I love that question so much. Thank you for asking it. I think part of my answer has to do with pedagogy and education. The training of artists is a really good training for crossing species communications. It's a training where we are trained to see the most subtle things, to have freedom to use our imagination until it takes us to something that, might not be imagined. And it also is a training of critical thinking and why it's important, to have interspecies humility and communication. And I feel very humble and like I'm just starting to be able to answer that question. I'm not sure I have any answer to that question, but I felt a huge yes when you asked it, because I think art is a perfect space for also expressing value. And so arts express what a culture values, and that can be many, many things. But the turn of so many artists being interested in interspecies matters is very encouraging to me. Yeah.
I think about the philosopher Martin Buber writes about two modes of being in the world, one that he calls the I-it mode of relations, and one he calls the I-you. And I think that a lot of the misery, the deep misery, has to do with the loss of I-you modes of being. And I think that art is a space that really helps emulsify the I-it attitude, that helps to sort of it helps in the work of de-objectification. And that mind, the de-objectifying mind, I think is the core of the beginning of reciprocity, whether it's between human beings or between humans and non-humans, or between different types of consciousness, like human consciousness and, say, time-based earth consciousness or processual consciousness. All of that, to me, depends on questioning that the rigidity of the I to it model.
Yeah, I think everything you three just said, I would add that these types of communication and these types of thinking, there's so few cultural spaces where it's okay to be like, yeah, I talk to rocks and they talk to me. You know, it sounds completely nuts in most contexts, and that's one of the things that I think art is most important, that extremely important role that art plays in this. I think of it as the transition that we're in culturally, is that it opens up anything goes. Like, you can do anything as an artist, pretty much. And there's so few cultural spheres where that kind of openness is not just okay, but good.
Last year in Poland, you said something exactly as an answer to this question that can I repeat?
Sure.
You said that art is a transformational space.
Yeah.
And that's the core, really. Its purpose of being is transformational.
Yeah. And I also think, I will stop talking in a moment, but I think that art is often written off as like this avant-garde thing that I don't get it. Like, how's that doing anything in the world? And also, if we look at the history of human culture, new ideas always start in art. New ideas always begin in art. Various modes of art, pick one, it's there first. And then it'll filter into the rest of the culture. So ideas that at first seemed completely off the wall eventually become common sense, and it begins in art. So it doesn't matter if your work as an artist, and I love that you're forming an art collective, yay. It doesn't matter if your work like communicates to everyone. If it communicates, like Jason was saying, to one person, that one person has an effect on innumerable numbers of people that just cannot be predicted, and that's how cultures shift. Sarah, I started talking, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to this question of art and cultural change.
I think, but then I'm thinking both from my own work, but also very much from my work at sea, where I work partly with artists, and in earlier years also with tourism. A big difference that I see what art does is the way how we can be in a place and how we can relate to a glacier, where thinking or feeling through art, it's not about the glacier entertaining you, which in many cases, many other cases, it is actually. But it's not so much true art. It's not about a landscape or a glacier giving you something, entertaining you, but it's really the looking at it and the being able to spend time with it that happens through art. It does happen also sometimes in other cases, but mostly through art.
Yeah, I love that it's about an exchange, not about entertainment. And so much of our world is about entertainment for so many of us. Yeah.
You had a question.
And it's entertainment, like a fast element.
Yeah.
And then the next. Yeah. And that's art is able to stop that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me was, I had a kind of an instant reaction to the whole discussion of language. Mm-hmm. And I just, I've grown up and been immersed in a world of language and talking and explaining, and, like when I look at this, I don't want to talk about that woman. I don't want to have her described. I want to be that woman. I want to be in that picture. I want to just immerse myself in that and not in all the words that go around that, because that somehow seems detractive to me. And so, but you clearly have and maybe it's the way you define language or talk about it, but anyway.
Yeah, I'm just going to try to restate this. And Sarah, we're looking at the large print of yours and using that as an example of something that we don't want to translate into language, that we want to allow it to be its own language. I completely understand the aversion to translation of an image or of any work of art. Like, I don't want to translate anything. I don't want to say what this means, Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, why, people do that with poetry a lot. It's like, what's the poem about? It's like, well, why would I write the poem if I could tell you what it's about? Like that's the point of art, is that it's its own entity. I think of language as a medium, just a separate medium that can add another layer of complexity, emotion. It extends tendrils out into the world that some people get really excited by, some people don't want it, and I think all of the above, all of those reactions are worthwhile and valid. But, yeah.
I think that question is also really interesting in terms of this show and what has been happening in the different artists' work and the reception of it that I've heard of, and that is in a kind of white European-focused context, language is prioritized. Words are prioritized, and animism or kind of interspecies fluidity, knowing, is not as prioritized. And so I think one of the refreshing things for me about being part of this show is that it's brought up a lot of conversations about why that might be, what the implications of that are, and might we be at a moment where we're ready to shift a little bit.
It seems there's a famous story, you probably know this, about Robert Frost, and someone asks him what his poem means, and he says, did you want me to say it worse? Yes, that's it. I think that that works of art, and especially images, are radical cultural objects in our moment, and because they're in a certain way anti-informational, and I think that we bring words to them in an effort to struggle with what that actually poses to us, what that state of radicality, of being without language really means to us. And on a certain level, I respect the lack of words. On another level, and I think that this show, in my eyes, succeeds really beautifully in this, on this other level, we look to words not to tell us what something is or what it means, but to catalyze it into sense. It's not a pinning down or a flattening, but it's a sort of the opposite. It's an enlarging of meaning that comes because we understand the catalytic nature of language. And to my mind, this show, the writing on the wall is extremely important in the exhibition. And if any of you haven't seen the catalog, it's extremely important to the sort of larger whole that the exhibition makes. And the writing is like that. The writing has that, to me, that catalytic effect.
Heidi or Sarah, I don't know if you want to add anything to this idea of language as part of the work you make. I know we've talked about this a bit, but we're taking a slightly different approach.
As soon as someone sees the work, there's language. Or there's a possibility for language. As soon as someone else sees the photo and recognizes something, and it might be poor language, it might be difficult to put words, but as soon as it evokes someone in a person, there is a possibility to put it into language or to search for that language.
Yeah, we're a very verbal species. And so as soon as we perceive something, many of us, not all of us, are thinking in terms of language. That's a good point. Heidi, any thoughts?
I like what's there.
Okay, all right.
Let's see how we are on time. We have maybe time for, question.
These are from the online.
Fun. Wow, I feel so high tech right now. Juniper, hello, thanks for tuning in. Artists and activists often want to also contribute to the eco-restoration that is so necessary today. What are the ways that you as artists use your work as a tool for regeneration and stewardship?
That's a good question.
Yeah, thank you.
I could jump in because of the Mine project, which I think relates to this. But what to say about it? I think that activism, okay. I believe the moment requires so many approaches to activate the future we wish to have for our children, our grandchildren, for all of our cousin species. And so I'm keenly aware of how some of the work I do, I would consider activist, like writing letters to a mine site, a Superfund site. That is challenging some of the protocols of this Superfund strategy, which is using heavy machinery to move around Earth to fix it and make it better, right? I'm listening and writing letters and trying to encourage some public dialogue, and I think that's an activist gesture. Whereas other works like the mess kit for settlers don't feel like activist work to me. Maybe a little bit in the framing, but mostly this is stuff from my life that I make, and I made an installation with it.
But I want to add on to that because the question also has to do with remediation, and what was the word that was used? Stewardship and regeneration. And you do, I mean, you are a farmer.
Yes, and I care a lot about regenerating soil, and there's that. I think the bottom line for me is that there's all of these ways to approach it, and I don't prioritize one over the other. I'm really curious to hear what others think about that question. It's a great question.
Heidi, you want to jump in?
Okay. I love that question. Thank you for asking that. And I think an obvious answer, I could tell you some stories about specific times when I've worked with specific individuals, and through that process of us connecting to an ochre or earth pigments from a particular place has led to direct cultural renewal or cultural regeneration, which leads, of course, to land regeneration. Those are deeply interconnected. But I think the part that I really want to bring in, just because, again, it's crucial and maybe not as talked about in the earth stewardship practices, is the remediation of the subtle realms. Like, a lot of my work has to do with listening to dreams and then directly connecting to a place in the land that I saw in a dream. And that those organs of perception are atrophying for a lot of people in this time, and as the earth is becoming a more brutalizing force, or that's how we are experiencing it. And I think if we don't also remediate the dream ecologies, our subtle body ecologies, at the same time that we're working in the ecosystems that we're working in, it's not going to have as deep and large of an effect, potentially. Like, that's really grandiose to say, but I want to explore what it means when we can be stewarding multiple ecosystems of where we actually perceive and operate on and function on, and that those are necessities equal.
Remediating the dream ecology is a beautiful phrase. Thank you for that. Sarah, I don't know if you have thoughts on this at all.
Just subtle thought, which is, I think, more thinking about my performance work than the photos. I think that the time difference is catching up on me.
Yeah,
I think that
middle.
I feel it. Like through my work and through the performances, there's always an aim to inspire and to activate an imagination that life can be lived differently. So a very subtle way of trying to open that imagination to, oh, I don't have to be part of this life as we easily think we are supposed to live, with a lot of consuming, a lot of traveling, a lot of moving, a lot of consumption on all levels.
Yeah, I love that. So by the role of art in expanding imagination is itself a form of activism. That's
a subtle form. But for me, when I first came here, that was a complete eye-opener for me, that you actually can live in a way like this. If you're born in the city, raised in the city, used to living that way, fast and full, it is hard to imagine that. And that is something that I think that, at least through my work, I try to communicate. So a very subtle way of changing the imagination of how life can be lived, which I think can have make big differences.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Anything you want to add, Jason?
I don't call this work I'm doing activist in any of those senses. I do have a question about the ways that contemplative practices have remediative consequences or remediative byproducts. I don't know that I'm comfortable speaking of contemplative practice instrumentally in that sense. I'm not against that goal, of course, but I don't really know whether, I don't know whether contemplative practices are remediative more than indirectly. Maybe indirectly they are, but that's an interesting question.
One phrase that you said a couple years ago that stuck with me is that art opens contemplative spaces in the world. And I hear this in what Sarah just said, I hear it in what you said, I hear it in what Heidi said, and that opening of contemplative spaces is a type of regeneration, and it's a type of stewardship of the imagination. I'm using the terms that Juniper used in the question. Yes?
I also think that one of the things that's very important between art is the artist and the viewer. Sometimes some artists are better at grasping the viewer and letting them experience or explore or get to the message. Some of them are a little bit more vague and sometimes don't. So I think that when you have that real strong connection, like you said, I think it sparks the activism and it sparks maybe other things that you had never considered when you saw the piece, and it may spur you to take further steps and do other things that you may not have considered. But I think that comes from the artist's message and how it's being received from the person that's viewing it as well, too.
Yeah.
So I think that makes a big difference as far as spurring something or initiating some type of activism or some kind of reaction. And like I said, some artists are a lot better at it than other artists, or some of them just tend to let the viewer kind of make up their own mind. So I think it has a lot to do with it as well, too.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to paraphrase Tyler's question from online. How can artists move beyond the gallery/museum space and engage with secondary audiences? How does art have an impact and foster change? And that's sort of adding on to the question we've been discussing, and it's an interesting question to discuss in a museum. And I think it's an important question, like what happens outside of the museum, outside of the gallery, that's also art. And you said, I want to start with you, Carol, because this work that is in this installation is 10 years in the making, and it's 10 years of you sort of stepping back from thinking about your art in a gallery or museum context. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I think it's important to add in that during that time, I was making art for audiences in community gardens, in public spaces, and so it's not like there wasn't an audience as much as it was elsewhere. So I think that it can be really healthy. For me, it was healthy to catch people in the middle of their lives and provide an art experience, sometimes very unexpectedly, because that opens up different ways of encountering art and framing art, understanding art. And in my experience, it was a dissolving between art and life and just really making it super tight. So I tend to see that as a very powerful space that takes a kind of courage to, just pierce that. It's very comfortable for me as an artist to be in a gallery or a museum, and it was less comfortable for me to, even though I love community gardens and have been a community gardener, I'm comfortable with that space, but to bring the art in was something that was a challenge to me as well as I think to the audiences.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah, I'm curious if you have thoughts, since I think of the work that you do as a guide, as a form of art. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, I think I'm always elsewhere. I'm never in a gallery, never in a museum. And well, when I work as a guide, I am, of course, I am me, but I'm also a very different person. So, but I still do communicate I have to be very practical. I have to care for all these people, and I very often feel that I am not there. But what I, well, in a good way, but as an artist, I'm not there. But what I communicate still very much has to do with the experience of the art and the art. And when I earlier talked about when we talked about the audience, and I said as well, then I was specifically thinking of a gallery or museum audience, because that is not something that comes natural to me, or that is close to my life. But apart from that, there's a huge, as so many people are passing by, there is a big audience. And I think, well, the guiding can be almost a performance sometimes. It's very useful or a lot of information can be passed on, but apart from that, also performance and storytelling or creating performances that become rumors and spread in these small communities like we have here. I think that can be a very strong way of reaching audiences that are not deciding themselves to go and look for art. And I find that especially interesting to subtly interweave that with small communities or ships communities, as we have when I'm at work at sea. Yeah. So the elsewhere is my here. For me, the gallery is the elsewhere.
Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you.
I think that artists live with a lot of ambiguity and have to live with a lot of ambiguity. You make something, you have no idea what difference it's going to make to somebody and when and for how long, and it seems like that the question of impact is one that an artist can really drive themselves crazy thinking about that. And there's a certain there's a certain solipsism that comes with not thinking about that at all. But to me, there's a core ambiguity that an artist just learns to live with, a kind of not knowing. I think it's the same for teaching.
I think too, to that question, one thing I wanted to add is that, like you were talking about making art in a community garden and how it feels a little uncomfortable. I think that part of what we can do to bring art out of, artistically deemed cultural spaces is to think of the art that's made in a community garden or in a subway or on a street corner or wherever as having just as much worth and value and cultural capital as art that exists in a gallery or a museum. And I think we're totally taught to think that's not true. And I think that it's just as meaningful for me to, and this is an other than human audience, but it's just as meaningful for me to walk out onto a mesa and draw something in the dust and call that art as it is for me to put something up on a gallery wall, and any version of that can be true. Heidi, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that question.
I just want to encourage going back to the beginning of this whole conversation of empathy, is that our audiences can always be rivers and microbes and, like you're saying, places, and that it's really, I found it really helpful and inspiring to work on the level of audiences, work on different levels of audience, which, not beyond human beings, is it spirits, is it rocks that I'm making work with or for, and then check in with the human level. That human audience is just also one of the audiences we can work with and that we are working with. So I just want to offer that as the audience is as plural as the work can be.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like that's a good note to end on.
Thank you all so much for tuning in online and for coming out tonight. And if you want to talk to the artists who are in the room or look at some of the work, please do so. And thank you, JC and Daniel and everyone, for making this happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you all for coming out. I would just like to say again, we're on the last 2 days of this show. Please feel free to take a look around right now. I'd also like to quickly plug our next exhibition opening will be on June 22nd. We're going to have New Worlds, New Mexico Women to Watch, which will be downstairs and feature 5 New Mexican artists. And upstairs, we're going to have a solo show from muralist Larry Bob Phillips. I'm sure you've seen his work around Albuquerque. And it'll be a show of completely new works. I'd also like to say, up at the front, we have membership brochures. If you're not a 516 member, I strongly encourage you to take a look and sign up. It includes VIP events, such as a members opening that we're going to have for our next one, as well as discounts and other perks, and it just supports our general operations here. So thank you and good night.
Thank you.